Among the problems being faced by society is the lack of resources, constant pressure on how money is spent. To fill the most urgent needs, is your most urgent need helping the people to become empowered through education or vaccination via healthcare? Government spending must also help the society in the greatest way. Any government must spend money in order to help those most at risk, i.e., to ensure that those persons have access to the wealth of a nation in some way or another. Everyone in the society can at least enjoy a minimum standard of living. This is done by placing subsides on basic human needs. A subside is a cost that is absorbed by a body government. It makes a commodity more affordable, accessible. In Trinidad, persons who are disabled have subsides on electric and water bills. Welfare expenditure. Welfare is highly criticized and considered quote, wasted money, because it is free money given away without gaining any return. Welfare includes pension, public assistance, box lunch, and widow's benefits. These encourage exploitation of the public system by the people. CDAP in Trinidad is for some the only way persons in society can access drugs, free health care, access to cheap loans from government agency HDC TTMF. Changing class boundaries and stratification issues. The Caribbean comes from a legacy of stratification. The stratification is essentially based upon socioeconomic factors. There is no Caribbean country that does not face stratification challenges. This causes inequity. The quality of the life of a person is reduced. Class structures based on race, gender, wealth always alienate a group of persons. Classism of any kind is always counterproductive. Antagonistic work. Relationships. There is obvious hatred, aggression between persons. There is a gap between employer and worker. Management becomes equivalent to the bourgeoisie class, and the worker sees himself as being oppressed. The worker will usually take steps to sabotage or reduce the levels of productivity. Poor work ethic. There is a demotivated workforce. People do the least in order to draw a salary. To redress this negative work attitude, a paradigm shift is required, where people have to address their own cultural attitudes. Institutionalized injustice. Caribbean people perceive that the system is built to oppress them. They believe that there is no opportunity for redress. People feel disempowered, especially when there are certain groups have money, some position, who always seem to succeed, get away with something. There is the perception that if you have money, you are immune to the effects of society. This leads to antagonism of the upper class. Discrimination. This implies a negative perception of a group, race, gender, age, group. Any class factor is used to alienate. People's quality of life is negatively impacted and their human rights are encroached. In order to deal with stratification and the negative impacts it has on development, Caribbean societies have to address those areas that perpetuate classism, such as addressing race politics, inaccessibility of education, laws that allow socioeconomic polarity, creating progressive taxation laws, training, opportunities for the masses, empowerment of the people, entrepreneurial drive and activity. An entrepreneur is a person who creates his own avenue for business. Therefore, the entrepreneur has been part of the Caribbean history. The entrepreneur becomes important to promote self-reliance and reduce dependency. He also creates employment opportunities for others in society. He now takes on the responsibility of giving others empowerment through jobs. Entrepreneurship is as important as enfranchisement. The entrepreneur adds to the national purse because he stimulates economic activity, creates jobs for others, and he pays taxes. The entrepreneur and the entrepreneurial attitude must be encouraged. Ways in which governments stimulate entrepreneurship. Legislation. Government can create laws to make a friendly environment, an environment that promotes the startup of the business. Such things as offering loans, e.g. in Trinidad, there is the Ministry of Small and Micro Business Development. Essentially, laws have to make the wealth of a nation accessible to a country. The government should make available technical advice, e.g. how to market your goods. Governments. Incentives such as tax rebates for small businesses. Consider that corporation tax exempts small businesses until they start earning a certain amount. Subsides on machinery, awards program that are incentives, creating specialized vending areas for small producers, e.g. vending areas in cities, farmers market, now. The government can also partner with the private sector to make preferential vending areas possible. Education. promoting educational opportunities in business, programs for training and advancement, scholarships for the business-minded. In recent times, CAPE has introduced tourism and entrepreneurship. Natural and Man-Made Disaster Review Module 1, Objective 5. Government policy. All government policies must seek to promote human development and environmental preservation whilst still generating wealth for a nation. Governments must fulfill the sustainable development paradigm. The policies must create empowerment, equity, productivity, and, therefore, sustainability. Ministry of Labor, promote the creation of jobs and can stimulate a healthier working environment. OSH ensures standards are met. Ministry of Labor may also decide on more equitable minimum wage. Maternity issues benefits, child labor laws, creating work schemes, creating work opportunities for the people. Ministry of Education, improved physical facilities, e.g., more schools, whiteboards instead of blackboards, training teachers by creating more tertiary places and scholarships, institute universal primary and secondary teachings. All governments in Trinidad have sought out to provide more scholarships each year. More scholarships, free box lunch, and giving laptops to students adds to education and moves towards sustainable development. The GATE program. Trinidad is the only nation in the Caribbean country to have this program. Ministry of Social Justice, all about empowering minorities, equitable distribution of aid, finances, more proactive approach. Ministry of the Environment, creating legislation to protect, safeguard the environment, creating watchdog agencies, e.g. EMA, to monitor how our landscape is altered. They are also responsible for spreading awareness of environmental concerns. This might be a part of the educational aspect, promoting sustainability through the environment. Only in 2015, the hunting season was opened in Trinidad, creating laws to protect what we already have. Alterations to our natural environment will have long-term negative effects. There is disregard for existing laws, use of technology and technological factors. Technology and mechanization is a reality of the industrial and social landscape of the world. The use of technology has never been a major point in the Caribbean. The Caribbean has evolved from labor-intensive forms of agriculture. The legacy in the Caribbean is not dependent on technology, but on the labor. Labor-intensive production is not sustainable as people are usually lazy. The use of technology will have benefits of enormous scale and can impact upon the economy by providing higher levels of productivity, output, and income. Technology and education, easier means of communication, faster rates of learning, and more efficient methods of record keeping. Technology and tourism, creating visibility, advertising on the internet, bookings and reservations, increased market share due to remote capability provided through technology and medicine. In the Caribbean, we are dependent upon metropolitan medical services. This is due to not having the necessary specialists and/or equipment. Medical services will impact upon our pillars of development by making our population healthier. Advantages: higher levels of efficacy, output, and income generation, lowered cost of production, creation of spin-off jobs, greater access to knowledge, greater access to recreation, greater access to education, more reliable systems of information storage and retrieval. Challenges to the use of technology: costly. Caribbean countries have little money. Technology requires high amounts of energy, and not all Caribbean countries produce energy. Landscape of some territories prevent use of technology. Jobs will be rendered redundant, obsolete, incur unforeseen expenditure. It may put traditional industries into jeopardy, e.g., fast food production may render traditional foods as undesirable. Because of the access to all types of movies, the local drama industry is undesirable. New types of illegal activities, e.g. privacy, access to questionable material, detritions of the social and moral fabric of society, displacement of local producers of goods due to online shopping, outflow of the nation's wealth due to online shopping, global conditions. There are certain global issues that are pressing to how Caribbean countries deal with these. There are environmental issues, human well-being issues, MDGs, national security issues, global threats. The Caribbean is a member of the global environment, and that problems that face the world face the Caribbean as well. Because of our small size, economically, population, geography, the Caribbean is more susceptible to global changes than are many of the larger territories of the world, e.g. inflation, Large nations can better deal with it than small nations due to stronger economy. The countries are too small to change global situations. Therefore, we are more reactive than proactive. We follow international trends. The LDCs, lesser developed countries, usually have a legacy of dependency upon metropolitan nations. Changes in patterns of spending in tourism can happen if there is an economic crisis in the world, and this will affect LDCs. E.g., in 2008, 2012, there were crashes due to drop in oil prices actions. In 2015, there is an impending crash. Our situation of economic dependency means that changes in national economics will have a ripple effect on the Caribbean. In 2008 and 2012, because of recession, Caribbean countries, Barbados, St. Vincent, St. Lucia, took a downturn, not Trinidad due to possession of oil and gas. This is one thing that is important that affects oil-based economies, Trinidad and Tobago. In 2013, the United States, which is our major importer of crude oil, discovered how to get oil out of shale clay through frackings, that our main buyer has reduced consumption. This impacts us even though it was not a global crisis. Global changes in the economy, climate change. In the mid-2000s, the price of corn and wheat increased. Bad weather in Russia, chicken prices increased. In order to enjoy sustainability, our attitudes to the environment must change. Environmental concerns seem to affect third world nations. Whether it's because of our luck, geographical location, the third world nations have the most forests. The world has become aware that the forests are the lungs of the earth. The nations with forests are therefore important, e.g. Guyana. Metropolitan nations want other nations with forests to become more conservative with their exploitation of the forest reserves. However, they do nothing to help subside the income generated by these nations. The metropolitan nations are also the ones that consume the products, e.g. lumber. The Millennium Development Goals become problematic to Caribbean nations. They were supposed to become a reality in 2015, but this has not happened. In truth, Caribbean nations don't have enough money to achieve advances in Millennium Development Goals. There is also a lack of investments by metropolitan nations. Sometimes these can be good poor, and this reflects the global environment. E.g., if America has hard times, we shall not get anything from them. Caribbean nations depend on FDI, foreign direct investment. Therefore, without FDI, we can't do anything. Our lack of accumulated wealth accounts for our dependency upon IMF, International Monetary Funds, and the World Bank. Taking loans from the World Bank MF can lead us to a worse position than we were before. Human trafficking. This is important for the Caribbean because the Caribbean becomes a major transshipment point for the movement of human cargo, especially from South America. African refugees are using the route from Africa to the Caribbean, then to the United States. Human trafficking is modern-day slavery. The movement of drugs is related to human trafficking. The Caribbean is under heavy suspicion, and immigration laws change because of this. South America sends drugs to the Caribbean. Environmental factors. Our economics depend on ecotourism. Any natural event, global in scale, will affect our ecotourism. Quality and relevance of our education. Investment in education is the investment in development. Any kind of empowerment must begin with education simply because you cannot give everybody access to a loan. Education is easiest, most practicable. Therefore, the Caribbean must make educational opportunities available in order to improve your human resource. To get rid of inequity, you have to give everybody the opportunity to become mobile. Education is the most sensible way for this. Since indentureship, Caribbean people have realized that education allows the most social upward movement. We must make our education compatible and equivalent with that of the world. We must take our education into the 21st century. What is done in the Caribbean must have a global relevance and must be seen by the world to have a high quality. This is an ironic twist because in 2004, the Caribbean abandoned GCE as an A-level examination body and adopted CAPE, which is not globally recognized. While we know that GCE is better, we moved to CAPE to gain a level of autonomy and self-respect. Caribbean students, therefore, have difficulties getting into foreign universities. In order to improve education, we need modern classrooms, the use of technology, and the need of teacher training for the 21st century. Methods of training. All these require money. which the Caribbean has little of. We are limited by one thing, or, in recent times, the Cape body has been introducing more subjects. This is an advancement in our education. UWI has also introduced more degrees, e.g. degree in maritime engineering. Tourism. This has the most significant potential to boost development in the Caribbean because the Caribbean has the ecological basis that acts as a magnet for metropolitan tourism. The majority of our tourist clients come from North America and the Western Hemisphere, the Netherlands. Many Caribbean countries, Tobago, St. Lucia, St. Vincent, Jamaica, depend heavily upon tourism for most of their GDP. Tourism creates several developmental opportunities, such as employment opportunities for many. Asia. Barbados boasts that more than 80% of their population is employed by tourism, directly. Indirectly, more than 40% of their GDP is from tourism investment spending. This means that tourism can be a viable factor in economic development. Upstream and downstream industries. Assume tourism is the main industry. Upstream is what goes into flight agencies, insurances. Downstream is what comes out, taxi services, restaurants. Some industries may be both upstream and downstream. Tourism is important for development because it helps to stabilize the economy through foreign exchange. We are import-based countries, e.g. we use foreign-made toothpaste and toothbrush, foreign-made toilets, soap, tea bags, microwaves, cars, clothes, etc. Most things we use are dependent upon a foreign investor. Tourism gives us foreign revenue to purchase these items. In 2013, 2014, and 2015, the Central Bank of Trinidad and Tobago had limited U.S. dollars. This was in parallel with the U.S. recession. Tourism promotes inertia. Once there is positive feedback, tourism will grow. Our perception can increase, and this continues our tourist potential. Tourism raises our environmental appreciation. E.g., people will come from Japan and Australia, come to see the Buku Reef and Scarlet the Ibis. People will come to the realization that these are worth something and will try to utilize it. People may also change their attitude to the environment. Etiquette is taught in Barbados so as to improve the hospitality of the nation. Caribbean people's attitude is very bad. Trinidad is based on oil and gas, so we do not focus on hospitality. Therefore, Trinidad will have a bad reputation as being disrespectful hosts. Many of the major hospitality agents have invested in the Caribbean. Every one of our 4-star hotels in the Caribbean, except Sandals in Jamaica, whose management is foreign, but it originated in Jamaica, originated from foreign investors. Negatives of tourism. Cultural imperialism. When locals see a tourist living his life, they will want to adopt their identity and drop their own. This can lead to cultural erasure. Stratification of society, e.g. in some areas in Jamaica, there is Negril, which is especially for the tourists. Locals are unwelcomed. In Tobago, Pigeon Point Park was accused of having a racist Eurocentric agenda where Pigeon Point was catering exclusively for white people. Black people, local people, could not get into Pigeon Point Park. Inflation. Due to indirect increase of goods, local consumers have to pay higher tourist prices. Diseases. Movement of people implies movement of pathogens. In recent times, there have been several influenza scares, bird flu, swine flu, Ebola, etc. This means there can be diseases brought in that we aren't prepared for. STIs and STDs can pass as well due to sex tourism, industries, e.g. Barbados, Tobago, and Jamaica. In the 1990s, Simona Fricker from the Netherlands had sexual interactions with several men. These men were all in the sex tourism industries. Back then, there were no laws regarding knowingly giving someone HIV/AIDS. Decay in morals and values, due to sexual conduct, misconduct of people. It may spark underground drug industries, debauchery, tourism, weed, alcohol, and sex, also known as hedonism. This can cause problems with the law. Civil problems, due to violence towards tourists. E.g., in 2011, a tourist couple with the last name Green were attacked in Tobago. Challenges facing tourism in the Caribbean, lack of publicity, and marketing on the Caribbean's part. To sell something, you have to make it visible, advertise. There needs to be vigorous marketing campaigns by the nations themselves. There is also an agency for this. Lack of infrastructure and modern conveniences. To make tourists comfortable, you must have infrastructure to allow mobility, proper roads, air, and seaports. These cost money. Lack of infrastructure is also seen in the water and electric shortages. Creating infrastructure means diversifying your tourism product. e.g., Grenada was one of the first nations to embark on yachty tourism. Other nations have not embarked on this because of a lack of money. Trinidad has followed Grenada with this type of tourism. Levels of crime, e.g. Greens and Tobago, also occurs in Jamaica and Trinidad. Metropolitan nations provide bulletins and advisories about the high crime rates in these countries. Poor attitudes. Some nations are hostile towards tourists, e.g. Trinidadians. Natural disasters. These will destroy the ecology, infrastructure that generates income. Tourism is highly fickle, capricious, meaning it is subject to changes in trends. Tourism-based nations must be dynamic and constantly change their advertising. Once they lose their appeal, it is difficult to get it back. Natural disaster can nullify your tourism industry for a period of time. The long-term spin-off means that you can lose your tourism entirely. Political instability, e.g. Haiti. For the tourist to feel safe, there must be law, police, etc. Lack of diversification. Caribbean depends upon SSS, sand, ecotourism. The Caribbean is not particularly unique. They all have the same tourist niche. We therefore compete with each other, and this will lead us nowhere. Trinidad is developing a cultural niche, carnival. Guyana is developing adventurous niche, adventure. Activities, Cuba has a health niche. St. Vincent, St. Lucia, and Grenada has developed a spa niche, where they utilize their secondary volcano features. Tobago is developing a niche, where they sell culture and heritage with the Tobago Heritage Festival. Module 2, Specific Objective 3 Globalization and Development. Globalization is an unavoidable, revolutionary macroeconomic concept that envisions the world as a global economy. Globalization emphasizes that for facilitation of global trade, there must be understood and accepted standards of trade and fair trading practices. Only when these are achieved will another objective of globalization called trade liberalization, the movement of goods, capital, and people across international boundaries with minimal restrictions, be accomplished. So, globalization attempts to promote equity for all buyers and sellers and to remove all barriers to trade, such as taxes and tariffs, quota restrictions, and duties. Essentially, globalization is an ideology that attempts to promote business in a global platform. Agents of globalization, multilateral agencies, International Monetary Fund, IMF, the World Bank, World Trade Organization, TO, Economic Partnership Agreement, EPA. As a business concept, globalization seems to favor technology-advanced manufacturers, metropolitan nations, more than developing LDCs, lesser developed countries, third world nations. Therefore, it is oftentimes to the demerit of developing nations. According to globalization, the producers and movers of goods get all the business. Metropolitan countries are pushing globalization because they perpetuate economic control on a worldwide level. Globalization can be divided into certain categories: economic, globalization, money and goods; sociocultural, ideological globalization, cultural imperialism; political globalization, impact of metropolitan policies; media and telecommunications, globalization. Positives, benefits of globalization. An open market policy is promoted. More accessibility to markets, more profits. Because of increased competition in the market, local producers are pushed to improve their products, business strategies, and level of efficiency. It means cost effectiveness. Expansion of choices for consumer. They can make better decisions, higher quality of life, with free movement of capital, goods, etc. There are new foreign direct investment FDI opportunities. Foreign investors can now come in the country and employ local workers. Economic turnover and the multiplier effect will continue. Greater levels of international exposure, tourism advertising via media. A household name can be gained by the movement of goods. Trinidad and Tobago bitters. International aid will become easier. Increased tourism opportunity. There is removal of many restrictions to travel. Ideally, with people being able to move more efficiently, there is more tourism. Higher levels of scrutiny promotes a higher level of accountability and transparency in which Caribbean governments conduct themselves. Adoption of beneficial ideology, e.g. gender equity, environmental conservationism, better attitudes towards elderly and children. Negatives, drawbacks of globalization. Local industries, forced into downsizing and closure. For Caribbean entrepreneurs, the future is grim because their businesses are small scale and lack technology. It also leads people to losing their entrepreneur spirit. Unemployment. a government will now be faced with a great social welfare burden, creating an enormous opportunity cost for development. Disparity in socio-economic status of a nation, foreign industries can pay their employees more, distorting wage scales in the nation. This can cause socio-economic polarization. New types of crimes, diseases, invasive species, Trinidad and Tobago exporting cocaine in juice tins, growth of drug industry, money laundering, cybercrimes, black markets and smuggling of illegal objects, movement of diseases. In Barbados, AIDS is rampant. Diseases can be environmental, e.g. red palm mite raging in the Caribbean. Coconuts thus get scarce and expensive, e.g. invasive species, lionfish are introduced. No natural predators, they alter the ecosystem. Exploitation of natural resources, extracting companies, mine quickly, no time left for restoration of resources. Outflow of cash from the Caribbean. Online shopping has an economic edge. Many persons are cut out from making a living. Cultural erasure and imperialism, forms of media content, are being bombarded by metropolitan messages. Eventually, we identify with the metropolitan messages. We become discontent with our ideology and idolize theirs. Promotion of neo-Marxism, neo-colonialism, and neo-imperialism. This implies that the bourgeoisie class, metropolitan nations, proletariats, LDCs, facilitators / agents of globalization, World Trade Organization, TO, the most representative agent of globalization because they craft rules for international trade and movement of goods. This comes in the form of economic opportunity, trade of resources. The WTO began as the GATT General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and the same principles that applied then applies now. In order to sell goods to participants within the WTO, nations must adhere to their taxation and trading policies. The Caribbean had no choice. We depend on metropolitan goods. However, to be allowed into global trade, the WTO requires certain prerequisites to be fulfilled: democratic system of government, a free market model of economy. A nation must remove all barriers to trade. The WTO policies are filled with double standards. This is because China doesn't fulfill the prerequisites, yet they are in the WTO because they produce everything. The WTO is the global institution that adjudicates on trading disputes between its members. The WTO is controlled by metropolitan nations. Therefore, the global nations USA, UK, France, Germany, Russia, the WTO, and their relationship with LDCs fulfill a neo-Marxist paradigm. Economic Partnership Agreement. This is a trade agreement. The Cotonou Agreement is an EPA which replaces the Lomé Agreement. The EPA allows a phase-out of preferential trading while allowing WTO trade liberalization policies to be implemented. The Cotonou becomes a compromise. The ACP nations will be allowed a transitional phase. The EPA allowed the ACP nations to integrate into economic globalization ideology. The EPA becomes a continuation of goodwill to one time colonial territories, challenges resulting from discontinuation of Lomé. Social cultural. There is a negative impact to cultural identity. For 500 years, ACP nations were planting bananas, but they had to stop. This causes cultural dislocation. There is social incohesion in communities. Certain societies are kept together because of occupation. Certain societies bond because of jobs in fishing villages. With the loss of the banana industry, there is social dislocation and loss of tradition. Unemployment produces psychological impacts, a fear of not feeding family. Change in use of land as farmers will no longer see arable land as viable. Economic unemployment, direct and indirect employment, negatively affected. There are negative spin-offs, such as greater burdens on government resources, less people contributing to GDP, reduced GDP, rationalization of expenditure. Hardships on people. There will be social welfare cutbacks, spending that seeks to reach the at-risk population. Those who are living dangerously close to the poverty line will fall under the poverty line. Decrease in capital investment expenditure. There will be reduced development, to construct infrastructure. There will be a contraction of locally generated employment, and ripple effects will occur. SEPUP will come to an end. Migration in search of better opportunities. Loss of investor confidence as a spiral of decrease occurs. Negative international reputation. In a worst-case scenario, there may be capital flight. Also, FDI and new investment will be inhibited. International Monetary Fund is a bank which helps nations meet their balance of payments need, i.e. help with expenses. The IMF will only lend money if a nation adheres to its recommendations, policies, structural adjustments, and austerity measures. The IMF makes these policies to ensure they are repaid. The structural adjustments are sound on paper, but in reality, they sink a nation. Among the policies are devaluation of currency. Through devaluation of currency, your items will be cheaper on foreign markets, i.e., metropolitan money has more buying power. Ideally, more exports will sell. The problems are devaluation of currency does not factor in the types of goods we export. Our end quote market goods end quote are inelastic in demand. Developing nations are import-based economies. Thus, by devaluating currency, we pay more for import goods. Downsizing of the public sector. This results in unemployment. The public sector is government jobs. The government is the biggest employer in any nation. Via downsizing, a large portion of the population will be rendered redundant. Reduction in public spending and social welfare, cut in pensions, school feeding programs. Hardships will be created for the end quote at risked end quote population. Privatization of industry. There are national and private industries. A national industry is driven by economic incentives. It acts in the long-term welfare of the nation. It is owned by and works for the benefit of a nation. A national industry may be subsidized by a government. The price of goods to the consumer needn't be for a profit, e.g. goods such as electricity, water, and telecommunications in Trinidad. National industries help us to enjoy the wealth of a nation by providing goods that are uneconomical to buy in small quantities. A problem with national industries is inefficient production of goods. This leads to wastage, corruption, and theft, resulting in leakages. The government thus loses money. Private industries are driven by a profit incentive. Therefore, the goods that are produced will be sold at the highest possible profit margin. The goods will be produced as cheaply and efficiently as possible. The IMF recommendation for privatization can be negative for the people, i.e., if a private company had to sell basic goods such as water and electricity, it would be sold without subsides, and the consumer will have to pay full prices. The goods that government produces on large scales are necessary for development. If these end up in the hands of private owners, there will be exploitation. Salary caps and salary cuts. Salary caps imply that one's salary remains fixed for a period. Government workers are allowed to negotiate their salaries at certain intervals. A salary cut is where the whole public sector's salary is cut by 10%. Savings tax, tax on savings in the bank, e.g. 10% tax on people who owned more than $75,000 in the bank. Blacklisting. A nation will have to revise its importation list. Some goods will be seen as unnecessary. In the 1980s, many goods were deemed luxury goods: rum, imported tobacco products, and fruits. Blacklisting results in reduced outflow of cash. This created hardships because industries plunged into turmoil, e.g. the baked goods industry suffered because of the lack of currents to make currants roll, the local people then used their ingenuity to make pawpaw rolls, which replaced the currants roll. Implementing new taxes, e.g. land, motor vehicle, this creates a greater burden in society. Reduced salary, devalued, currency, increased tax. Democratic system of government. The IMF can create more challenging times for a nation. People can revolt and rebel during hardships, e.g. the 1990 coup. The World Bank has the same stipulations for borrowing as the IMF. The World Bank is also responsible for implementing structural adjustment policies that have led to LDCs facing long-term difficulty, damaging their economies more than it helps. Difference between these multilateral agencies. The IMF focused attention on lending money for balance of payments deficits, whereas the World Bank is a project lender, focusing its attention on capital lending for developmental initiatives and infrastructure that could improve the quality of life for a people. The World Bank lends money for expansion of health facilities, regularization of water and water treatment facilities, electrification projects, improved measures and strategies to help prevent the spread of diseases. There is a more humane side to the activities of the World Bank. Underdevelopment. This is a feature of Caribbean economic reality, and it has linkages to a history of exploitation and capitalism. Our imperial powers have monetized and repatriated the wealth of the Caribbean. None of the Caribbean wealth was reinvested in its development. This underdevelopment was motivated because of an attitude of exploitation and an attitude that sees the Caribbean as expendable. Underdevelopment is linked to actions of multinational enterprises. The World Bank, IMF, and our imperial masters can be perceived as agents of underdevelopment. Similar to the actions of our imperial masters, the multilateral agencies develop policies to exploit our wealth and resources. Neo-Marxism, neo-colonialism, neo-imperialism, these speak about political and economic power on a global basis. The historically imperial nations, e.g. France, Spain, England, control global economics. They control the IMF, World Bank, and WTO. These agents replace the monarchy. There is an economic puppet instead of a political one. The Caribbean finds itself in a sad state due to its economy. Dependency theory, a psychological set of circumstances where a person is socialized into becoming dependent. African slaves and East Indians were disempowered on the plantation and estate, respectively. The oppressed people were socialized into thinking that everything has to be received from the white man. The dependency theory can be extended to an international political and economic platform. The Third World nations look at the metropolitan nations for opportunities. Implications of globalization in the Caribbean, trade and industry, capital investment, commerce, education and culture, labor and migration patterns, distributional sector. We are impacted because of certain characteristics, since interaction with the Caribbean is skewed in favor of the rest of the world. Characteristics of LDCs: lack of capital, lack of natural resources, lack of technology, skills and education, import-based economy, heavy dependence on low-yielding, labor-intensive jobs. Ideally, because of globalization, trade between nations should have illustrated improvement for both Caribbean and metropolitan nations. However, in the Caribbean, our trade has been negatively impacted. There has been the loss of the Lomé and the flooding of Caribbean markets with cheaper alternative goods. This means that foreign goods dominate the market at the expense of local goods because metropolitan nations enjoy mechanization, cheaper production, and economies of that scale. When more units of a good or a service can be produced on a larger scale, yet with less input costs. There is an increased outflow of cash from Caribbean societies as we employ the foreign businesses at the detriment of our own. There is a possibility of demerit goods, e.g. cheap alcohol and cigarettes, drugs, socially and morally corrupted materials. There is a loss of entrepreneurship. Local businessmen can't compete with foreign businessmen. The prices affects our buying preferences in the country. Unemployment, social welfare burden, increased load on tax payers. Multinational corporations exploit weak legislation. They target certain nations in order to save money, e.g. they go to India, Mexico in order to access child labor. They go to places where they won't have to pay for environmental cleanup. E.g. in Trinidad and Tobago, the proposed aluminum smelter plant would have created toxic chemicals which could have been released into the open. Coupled with cultural imperialism, the economic impact because of these is exaggerated. Globalization and capital and investment. Ideally, because of globalization, Caribbean nations supposed to receive more FDI and economic activity into the Caribbean. However, this is not entirely so. In reality, there are new outflows of capital from the Caribbean with new types of economic activities such as e-commerce and online shopping. There are new types of financial crimes, e.g. money laundering, theft. Globalization has allowed multinational corporations to exploit and repatriate our resources. Because multinational corporations are not bound by law to remain once they declare bankruptcy, they can exploit rather than help development. Globalization and trade. Trade has increased. However, there is an emphasis upon metropolitan goods at the detriment of Caribbean goods. Metropolitan nations have advanced technology, economies of scale, and high levels of credibility because of their science. In the past, the U.S. market used protectionist methods to promote their own goods while deterring Caribbean goods. The U.S. was our largest importer of brown sugar until the 1940s. They began to produce sugar beet. It was branded healthier than brown sugar. This began the collapse of the sugar industry. After much research, it was noted that sugar beet was worse than brown sugar. The sugar beet was the basis of mono and polysaccharide substances as sweeteners. The U.S. killed our markets. In the 1960s, because of the U.S. industry, they advanced The revolutionary crop, the soya bean. The soya bean oil was advertised as healthier than coconut oil. This resulted in the collapse of the international coconut industry. The U.S. claimed that soya beans contained good cholesterol. In the 1990s, researchers found out that this was a lie. But the damage was already done. The U.S. promoted their own industries at the expense of the LDC's industries. Erasure and cultural hybridization via globalization. Since 1492, erasure began to take place, and to this day, it has not stopped. With easier access to goods, culture, and ideas, erasure would take place more rapidly. This is promoted by the prevalence of ideas. We are bombarded by metropolitan, imperial ideologies. This erasure implies we are becoming more and more Americanized, even though we don't realize it. Globalization and disease. Diseases spread due to movement of goods and people. In recent times, several pandemic threats have come into existence, e.g. H1N1, bird flu, swine flu, cholera, Ebola, and Zika virus. There is also a movement of STDs. There are sexually transmitted diseases in tourist-dependent nations, such as Barbados and Jamaica, which causes the nation money. Many Caribbean countries have experienced impacts due to movement of disease. This may cause public panic. Additionally, there is movement of disease with the movement of agriculture and related products, e.g. giant African snail. Social and moral decay. This is related to the role of media and corrupting influences of certain type of media content. The internet can cause exploitation of vulnerable people, e.g. pedophilia. The exposure to media promotes divorce, single-parent homes, and promiscuity. These are corrupting influences that damage the moral fabric of society. Brain drain and labor loss. Caribbean people idolize metropolitan nations for better standards of work, salary, and quality of life. When people migrate, there is a negative impact to our labor supply. This results in less jobs, productivity, tax income generation, less output. In a worst-case scenario, if people leave in large numbers, it may trigger an exodus. People tend to become frightened quickly. There is ERD, emotional regulation disorder, mentality. There's a movement of intellectual capacity. Because of labor migration laws, the people whom you don't want to leave are the ones who are encouraged to leave. With the loss of skills, it limits the developmental potential of a nation. Consider the human indicator, skills to population ratio. Lower ratios more promising, i.e., the lower the ratio, the more likely services will be accessible. E.g. 10:1 is better than 1001. A nation will have to spend money to access these skills, i.e., brain drain costs, government money that was previously invested. E.g. Trinidad and Tobago has students studying medicine in all UWI campuses in the Caribbean plus St. George's, yet they import doctors from Bangladesh, India, etc. The money invested into a person is on the premise that a person would give back. So when a person migrates, there is a loss of development and a contraction of the economy. However, there are some positives: remittances, spread of culture, promotion of respect for intellect, globalization and regionalism. Regionalism is a concept that promotes cooperation on a regional level. The Caribbean has responded to globalization on a regional economic platform called CARICOM. CARICOM is known as a FTA, free trade area, which means members enjoy certain benefits. CET, common external tariffs. Caribbean nations may be prompted to trade with each other instead of other traders of goods. This will allow the nations to have an economic advantage. However, the problem is all Caribbean nations produce the same products. The Caribbean has attempted to get into NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement, but was denied. Multinational, transnational corporations. These are characterized by an industry conducting its operations outside of its own nation. In this regard, multinational corporations are enabled because of the movement of industry, capital, and labor. Multinational corporations are a form of FDI and is a characteristic of Caribbean development. Multinational corporations are encouraged in the Caribbean. There is a lack of capital, so the promise of capital injection, job creation, and cooperate, taxation are all economic opportunities for Caribbean nations to build and expand development. FDI, as a part of development, was captured by a revolutionary economic structure called industrialization by invitation, too. This theory was created by a Sir Arthur Lewis from St. Lucia in the 1950s. He devises a formula by which LDCs may promote development. Industrialization by invitation attempts to attract foreign investment into LDC economy, using strategies such as making natural resources of a nation available to a company, providing cheap labor, providing lenient tax policies, providing cheap energy, sophisticated facilities, ports. Industrialization by invitation means that a country has no economic risk. The company takes the risk. In the Caribbean, the people are primarily uneducated in technical areas. We have low-yielding industries. The Caribbean lacks capital, technology, necessary markets, knowledge, and connections. Pros of multinational corporations: job creation, increase in standard of living, working of the multiplier effect, and economic turnover. Tax: ideally, they pay corporate tax on their profits in addition to royalties. With multinational industries, upstream and downstream industries can be created. Entrepreneurial activity is activated. Training, technical training, opportunities is stimulated for local people. Ideally, our people will become more educated and optimized in potential. In the best case scenario, when a company hires and trains local people, there is a transfer of skills needed to start its own company. E.g., in the 1940s, 1970s, the Point A Pierre Oil Refinery was owned by Texaco. However, in the late 1970s, Trinidad and Tobago purchased the rights to the refinery and all its assets from Texaco. Corporate spending: a multinational corporation spends money in society, fulfilling corporate citizenship. A corporate citizen takes care of his community. Some companies are encouraged to do this because goodwill is gained. Society appreciates your presence, and companies get tax write-offs. Corporate spending usually helps the human aspect of development. A company can promote training opportunities for people in the company. Empowerment: e.g., BP gives opportunities in mechanical work, agriculture, and design. People gain skills that won't make them a burden to governments, social welfare programs. Corporate spending has sponsorships, e.g., cricket teams, pansides, environmental campaigns, beach cleanups, scholarships to children of workers. Some companies offer national scholarships for postgraduate work for their local workers. Positive international reputation: if one company is doing well, it may encourage other similar type of industries to invest. This can promote positive inertia. Investment. Cons of multinational corporations: replacement of small companies, entrepreneurial spirit is killed, unemployment and disruption in a person's life.